My name is Kathy Hurley, and I am the manager of the Authors Group program. And we are delighted to have Carl Smith here today to talk about Chicago's Great Fire, in which we just had an anniversary, October 8th through 10th of 1871. That fire destroyed thousands of buildings in the city of Chicago, killed an estimated of over 300 people, and caused about $200 million of damage. That is a very long time ago, and that's a very big number. We're very, very happy to have Carl here today. Carl is a Franklin Bliss Sydney, did I say that right? Sydney Professor of English and American
Snyder, Franklin Bliss Snyder.
I'm sorry. I don't have my glasses on, I'm trying to read. American Studies and Professor of History Emeritus at Northwestern University, which we have on the Kellogg Executive Women's Network from Northwestern joining us today as one of our partners. So I'm happy to report that. Your books include Chicago and the American Literary Imagination of 1880 through 1920, The Urban Disorder and Shape of Belief, The Great Chicago Fire, which we will talk about today, The Haymarket Bomb, and the Model Town of Pullman, which we were just talking about, The Plan of Chicago, Daniel Burnham, who was a member of the Union League Club, by the way, and Remaking of American City and City Water, City Life, Water and the Infrastructure of Ideas, and Urbanizing Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. So you know history very well, Carl. We're really happy to have you again. And we have, as an interviewer here today, Dominic Pasiga. He's a PhD and also another emeritus professor of history with the Department of Humanities, History, and Social Sciences of Columbia College. Let's see, Dominic, you have a list of accomplishments here too. I would like just to start off and read that you have authored and co-authored or edited 8 books concerning Chicago's history, including Slaughterhouse, the Chicago Union Stockyard, and the World It Made. Also the biography of the Polish immigrants of the industrial Chicago. And your newest book is American Warsaw, which is the rise, fall, and rebirth of Polish Chicago. As we know, we have a lot of Polish Chicagoans here in our city, and happy to have them here. Let's see. We are also pleased to announce that Carl has been nominated by the Union League Club as an outstanding book author on Chicago history. So congratulations on your nomination, Carl. So with us here today, we also have a few partners I want to recognize. The Standard Club is here joining us. Like I mentioned before, CUNE, the Kellogg Executive Women's Network from Northwestern. We also have the Book Stall and, of course, our members of the Union League Club, who we are so proud that they are supporting this authors group program. I will put the Book Stall's information in the chat so that folks that want to buy your book, Carl, will be able to contact the Book Stall. We support the independent bookstores here in the city of Chicago. And so I guess today we are going to learn and find out, is the legend true? Did the O'Leary's cows really start this fire? Take it away, gentlemen.
Hi, Carl. How are you?
Fine. Thank
Good.
you. And thanks to Union League Club. And thank you very much, Dominic, for participating in this.
Well, I'm honored. Carl, you've undertaken various studies of Chicago, as we've already mentioned. But what brought you to this Great Chicago Fire? What brought you to this topic?
Well, I worked on the fire on and off in various ways for a long time. And what has struck me repeatedly is that while there are scholarly studies such as mine and what we might call anecdotal histories out there, there is no carefully researched book about just a narrative of the destruction of Chicago by the fire and what Chicago was like at the time, and then the rebuilding, and then the meaning of the fire in the city's history. And so it seemed to me a kind of hole, especially as we're approaching the 150th anniversary. And that I thought it would be fun to try to fill it and just tell the story. I've written about the fire before, and my other book describes the fire in 2 paragraphs. This is about 7 chapters. Also, I wanted to tell it more in what it felt like to experience it. So trying to tell it through the eyes of the people who were there at the time, and the fire again, and the rebuilding of the city.
Well, it's quite a monumental study. I enjoyed it very much. And I just wonder, could you tell us something about the dimensions of the fire?
Sure. The
Yeah,
fire,
yeah.
as Kathy said, lasted for about 30 hours from Sunday evening, October 8th, to very early Tuesday morning, October 10th. And it was absolutely remarkable. It's one of the great fires certainly urban fires in history, on the rank with the London fire and the Moscow fire and the San Francisco fire. It started on what we might call in the near west side, sort of a little south near Roosevelt Road, and burned part of the west side, but then it leaped the south branch of the Chicago River and burned the entire downtown of the city of Chicago, located more or less where it is today, and then burned virtually all the built parts of the north side of Chicago, which extended then up to Fullerton. Close to 3 square miles, 18,000 buildings, 13,300 of 13,800 in the North Division, north side alone, but the whole downtown, all the hotels, all the newspapers, all the restaurants, all the lawyers and other offices, putting 90,000 people, making them instantly homeless, and more than that, instantly out of work.
Well, fires are fascinating things, and they're funny things. Sometimes they burn part of a house. Sometimes if a church burns down, the altar remains untouched, and people talk about miracles. What's the most fascinating thing you found out about this fire?
Well, it's got so many fascinating things. I mean, just in some ways, just the straight facts of it, how at one point while it was several different fires at once. First of all, it's important to understand that because of the wind from the southwest and the upswirl of convection currents, the fire was throwing out burning pieces of Chicago, especially to the north and the east. So it's several different fires at once, which made it so hard to fight. And then it consolidated. So at one point, it's a wall of fire half a mile wide that could melt streetcar tracks. Bend them, melt glass, turn limestone to powder. Just, an astonishingly fierce experience. But in all of that, the most remarkable thing to me is just following all these lives of people sort of dealing with it in various ways. First, realizing that it's there, and it's very common, fires in cities at this time, but then realizing that it's going to be a very big and coming their way, and the decisions that they have to make about whether to run or not, whether to try to fight it for a little bit, what to take when they run, and then what happens afterwards. But again, the most fascinating thing are all the dimensions of the human story, which revealed the great variety of Chicago at the time.
And of course, the human story that we know best as Chicagoans, we all grew up with this story about the O'Leary cow and Mrs. O'Leary supposedly milking a cow at night, which nobody does, and causing all kinds of havoc in the city. Tell us a little bit about the O'Learys and why Mrs. O'Leary in particular was picked on so much.
Sure. One of the things I tried to do is get more at the story of people like them. Just by the nature of things, people who are wealthier or more literate or have access at time and space are the ones who left us most of the accounts of the time. But I wanted to find out much more and find out about them, especially since people like the O'Learys were stereotyped so much. But anyway, the fire started in or around the O'Leary barn around 9 o'clock that Sunday night. The O'Learys were in bed asleep at the time. It it was the reason that Chicago burned was not because of this particular fire, however it started, and we just do not know, but because the dry summer and the wind from the southwest and a weakened fire department from the fighting a major fire the night before made the city sort of created this perfect storm and caused all this damage. But what we know about them is that they were an Irish immigrant family born in the southwest of Ireland, probably married there, came over in the 1840s at the beginning of the potato famine. He served and went to Pennsylvania first, served in the Union Army, then came to Chicago. He was a laborer. She supported the family, which had 5 children at a time, including an infant, by this local milk business, which is again remarkable, so close to the center of town, all the livestock in the city of Chicago at that time. And then this fire began. They were members of Holy Family Church. They baptized their children there. They educated them there. And almost immediately on Monday morning, the story was already in circulation, given where it started, that this story that's completely false of this cow tipping over a lantern in the barn, causing it. And she was a perfect scapegoat. She was Irish, immigrant, illiterate, Catholic, female, and a woman. And it speaks, again, that speaks to the kind of timely quality of this. It expresses the kind of credible rumor that we're used to these things now so much in the midst of the pandemic and the election and so on. And people kind of are ready to believe the things they already believe, and try to fit it in that way, whether it's true or not. And it was very attractive also because it sort of put the blame outside of the mainstream of Chicago on this already suspect population. It also made it, this accident, so made it seem like something that we shouldn't be deeply worried about. It's too bad, but it just happened. But the real reason Chicago burned was because it had been built so quickly and sloppily and so completely out of wood. And it was as if the people had laid a fire and then the protections against it were inadequate. Plenty of warnings about it, but people did not want to pay more money, especially landowners did not want to pay more money in taxes. It's not politically popular, and the city burned.
Yeah.
And
Well,
this person was blamed.
It's also today not politically popular on property taxes.
Well, it is a universal thing, especially when it has to do with things that might happen.
Right. Right.
You know,
right.
people will pay taxes for this or that concrete thing, quite literally sometimes a concrete thing, a sidewalk or something. But why should we pay all this money for a fire prevention that might not, could happen and could not?
Sure.
And you talked about fascinating things. One of the things that, I always had heard that the reason there are these rear fire escapes in buildings, or the reason is that Chicago learned from the fire and rebuilt much more safely. Chicago did not do that. Almost immediately, a wooden city started to rise again. There very little fire regulation. Another significant fire in the South Loop area, including where the Standard Club was then, in 1874, less than 3 years after the fire, right near where the Union League Club is, in fact, and an area there. And Chicago finally did not start at all to put in stricter fire regulations until the National Insurance Board said, we're not going to write any more fire insurance there unless you take steps. And even then, the city dragged its feet. And it's really not till 40 years later or so that serious fire prevention techniques and regulations start to kick in, with Chicago as sort of the leading example nationally. we still have Fire Prevention Week. It's always during the week, and the president declares it, and it's always in the week of the Chicago fire, anniversary of the fire.
So the fire had this incredible impact not only on Chicago but on the country as a whole, and the country responded. And it's kind of interesting that some of the things you pointed out, the sort of anti-Catholicism, anti-feminine attitudes that pinpointed,
Anti-Irish is the strongest of them all.
yeah, that pinpointed on the O'Learys, also impacted on the relief and aid that came after the fire.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the remarkable things about the fire is this relief. There was no safety net as we think about it, however we think about it now. But because of Chicago, what it was and where it was, that is to say, it's this creation of the forces of westward expansion and industrialization in the 19th century. So it is this railroad nexus and this telegraph nexus. And by now, this is an international network, because since 1866, there was a reliable transatlantic cable. So the news of Chicago goes out instantly on the wires. So people in New York are reading about the fire Monday morning, and not just New York, in Iowa, in Boston, in everywhere in this country, and even in London, in places like that. And by the Tuesday morning, the London Times, this is a headline. This is about Chicago burning, but it's a headline Monday morning in New York because of time difference as well. And people, while the city was burning, are sending aid in terms of supplies and money to the city. There's a rally in Faneuil Hall in Boston on Monday afternoon while Chicago was still burning. We must send money to Chicago. And they do. And so about $200 million in 2020 equivalent is raised in money and supplies, and it's sent to the city for the relief of the people. But a private organization called the Relief and Aid Society, which really represents the kind of Protestant elite in the city, the people like Pullman, like Marshall Field and others, get the mayor of the city to give them control of this, and they dispense the aid. And they are very, very suspicious of immigrants and working people. And this is very similar to what the arguments now about the package of pandemic relief, that if we just give people money, they won't work. It's a disincentive. And these people want the city to be rebuilt the way, with them in charge and the way they want it to be. And so they have very strict rules about applying for aid, demanding, not taking people at their word, but demanding letters of recommendation from a respectable person, and then even going to their houses to make sure they're not faking in some way, or wherever they live at that point, and refuse to give aid if they don't take jobs, and very carefully administer it in ways that create tremendous resentment, not only among the Irish population, but very much among the even larger immigrant group in the city, the Germans. Remember, at this time, half of Chicagoans are born abroad. 1 in every 5 Chicagoans is born in Germany. 1 in every 7 or 8 is born in Ireland. And these are the majority of the people, and certainly the overwhelming majority of the working people. And they are treated with this great suspicion, and with no German translators in these interviews and so on. So it creates, the help is remarkable, and the Relief and Aid Society does in many ways a bureaucratically a very good job, but it reflects the kinds of prejudices and discrimination already there, and deepens class divisions in ways that redound in very bad ways through the 70s and 80s and 90s in Chicago.
Well, you might even say that it's the beginning of ethnic politics in some ways also. Oh,
certain. Well, it's certainly that way. And when you say that, it's because also these people constitute about 60% of the electorate And it's reflected in the Common Council, which was the name of what we now know as the City Council, and the people they elected. And this Protestant elite does not like these people. And there's a great power struggle that's been going on. It starts in the late 60s more, but the fire exacerbates, including elections of 1871 and 73. Their mayor elections were every 2 years then, not every 4 years.
Well, Chicago's recovery, however, was relatively short, I believe. The city rebuilt itself with a great deal of vigor and continued to grow. Frederick Law Olmsted talked about an initial optimism and sort of deflation of optimism afterwards, but it did seem to continue to grow with tremendous spirit, et cetera. And if you compare that to what's happened in, let's say, New Orleans and Katrina, where the growth has been actually very short and small, and in the recovery period is still dragging on from Katrina. How do you look at those two events?
Well, first of all, let's try to measure this very quickly. Chicago basically rebuilt in 2 years, and it would have kept building even on a boom, but there was a national panic, a very serious national depression in the fall of 1873, which halted things for a while. But within 20 years, by 1890, Chicago, which had around 330,000 people at the time of the fire, had 1 million people and was the second biggest city in the United States. The way to answer your question, Dominic, is in an odd way to say, if something so terrible was to happen, it couldn't have happened at a better time in Chicago's history. Chicago was the boom city of basically of the 19th century, certainly in America, and you could argue even more broadly in the West, more generally. And what's very important when these things happen is timing. So Chicago could rebuild so quickly because all the things that built it so quickly in the first place. Remember, Chicago didn't exist as in any urban sense 30 or 35 years before the fire.
Right.
It could be rebuilt as this central center of exchange of the raw goods from the West and the manufactured goods from the East, and people moving out to the West in this country, while New Orleans was already in a kind of downward arc at the time it was hit by Katrina. And this was a very devastating blow because there's just less resilience there, less of reason for it to rebuild. Chicagoans like to brag about the fire. Chicago is one of the few places that boasts about its destruction, celebrates its destruction, because the lesson that Chicagoans took from this destruction was that it was indestructible. Look, we rebuilt like that, and nothing could stop us. But the larger issue here is that at that time, this place was so important to the national and international economy that money and people just kept coming in, and it was rebuilt in the same miraculous way it was built. I don't want to discredit the local business leadership. They were remarkable, but it's really external forces that built and rebuilt Chicago.
And a lot of the things were not destroyed, right? The stockyards were not destroyed.
Yes.
The lumber yards in Pilsen were not destroyed.
Right. The railroad network, except right in the center of the city, the telegraph network right in the center of the city, most of the commodities, the grain and lumber and that sort of thing, not destroyed. As you mentioned, the stockyards were south of where the fire was. The most important thing that couldn't be destroyed was the city's location. As at the southwest tip of the Great Lakes, between the East and the Mississippi, and right on remember, it's 2 years after the Golden Spike is driven and the Transcontinental Railroad is finished. It is the place.
Yeah. So, Carl, some observers have both at the time and later have talked about it as sort of a blessing in a way, the silver lining, right? That Chicago was destroyed. And so how did the fire transform the city, especially, let's say, the Loop and parts of the South Side?
Sure. Most of the most historians think that the fire didn't really change the arc of Chicago's growth that much, but it accelerated it.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that it's a blessing in disguise is that it clears out a lot of shoddy buildings. And these are buildings that the landlords had no particular incentive to tear down because they were making a lot of money on them. Mm-hmm. But once they're leveled, particularly in the what we now know as the Loop area, let's call it the downtown. The Loop isn't built till 1897. There are terrible slum areas right in what we would call downtown, and they are just burned down in a night. And these areas become things like the Marshall Field Wholesale Warehouse and the Farwell Wholesale Store and things like that. And what's also happening in this period is that as these things get rebuilt, people and industry are moving out. This was already happening, but the fire accelerates it. The Mccormick Reaper plant was right on the north bank of the Chicago River near the Michigan Avenue, near what is now the Michigan Avenue Bridge, which didn't exist at the time. And it built, as many industries did, it rebuilt sort of along the south branch of the Chicago River and southwest of the downtown. What was already happening was what we think of as the streetcar and the commuter railroad revolution that enabled people who still work downtown to live farther out in the development of the suburbs or places above Fullerton and areas like that. And the fire in clearing out the downtown, making it a more attractive to business, also accelerates people moving farther out of the downtown, which is more and more available because of this local transportation revolution.
Well, Carl, it's a fascinating book. I enjoyed it tremendously. And I would like to make a prediction that this could be your second One Book, One Chicago.
Well,
first one was the 1909 plan book, which was just wonderful and excellent. And I think we're going to turn it over now. Are we not, Kathy?
Let me just point out one thing. In writing the book, for people who aren't familiar with Chicago, there are 7 maps that try to explain where all these things are, and there's about 70 illustrations, photographs, and drawings from the time to try to give you a kind of, again, vivid visual sense of how it was understood at the time.
And the maps were done by our mutual friend, I believe.
Yes, Dennis McClendon of Chicago Cartographics. Magnificent cartographer, and I'm a great Chicago historian
and a good friend.
Right, who lives about 3 blocks from the Union League Club.
Is he really? He should be a member. We should get him down here and become a member. By the way, we are open and we are operating, however, with the guidelines of the governor, but we sure hope to get back to our pace soon. We have a question from James Grimes. Mr. Grimes, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? I don't know.
I'm here, if you can hear me.
Yes.
My question was there any kind of financial panic that resulted from the fire?
Yes, but very, very brief. The stock and bond markets, shivered briefly, but the recovery within a month or two was done. There was no, when I say longer term drop like that. Again, one of the things I tried to do in this book was get down to particular cases. There are a lot of people who are badly hurt, but overwhelmingly, Chicago recovered very, very quickly economically as kind of moment of doubt, and then a kind of moment of what can I say, unjustified optimism, and then it kind of settled down to let's just do it. And and it did, but remarkably little of a shake in the economy.
So our next question is from mjka.com. That's all I have to go by. So I'm sure that that person will unmute themselves and ask the question in the chat.
My name's Michael, and I'm going on kind of a memory, but my recollection is that at the same general time frame as the October 1871 Chicago fire, there was a devastating fire in Wisconsin, perhaps
Absolutely.
with even greater loss of life.
Much greater.
Can you talk about that? Maybe compare and contrast
Sure.
the two fires and the resulting disparity in, let's call it, publicity about the fires.
Absolutely. This speaks to a larger set of conditions that caused the fire. There was virtually no rain through the summer of 1871 and into the fall. And there were fires all over the place in the upper Middle West. And on the very same night, there was a major fire in the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and its environs, which is near Green Bay. It's about 250 miles north of Chicago. And as Michael said, this is a far more devastating fire in terms of loss of life. The estimates vary, but as many as 1,500 people died in the Peshtigo fire. They're asleep in their homes and in this dry pine area, and whoosh, I've heard, I haven't verified this, that the word firestorm is coined in connection with the Peshtigo fire. It is, to this date, the worst single fire in American history in terms of loss of life. The Chicago fire, maybe a fifth of that, 300 people or so. It's hard to know for sure of people getting incinerated or a lot of single people in the city, and it's hard to trace. But this is a major fire, much larger area, many more people killed in it. And as you say, much less well known. There are, if you read Chicago papers in the days after, you even see headlines that says Peshtigo fire dwarfs Chicago fire and so on. But I think the reason is because of what I talked about before, Chicago being already in this spotlight on this communications nexus and involving many more people. But it being as terrible a fire as it was, people could see it coming and could escape. And that was not the case in Peshtigo.
And Peshtigo it's a small community. It's not really it wasn't the second largest city.
Right. One of the interesting factoids here is that one of the great builders of Chicago in the 19th century, William B. Ogden, who came from upstate New York and was the first mayor and was semi-retired and living in New York at the time, and on the same night lost his property in Chicago, and he had a large holding in lumber in Peshtigo. And he came out, he's in his mid-60s, and first came to Chicago, checked on things there, and then spent a month or more in Peshtigo trying to put things back together, and emotionally much harder tragedy. I might add, and this gets back to what I said before about the Chicago not learning its lesson, the single worst fire in terms of loss of life, and to this day, in a single building, and if you bracket the special case of the World Trade Center, is the Iroquois Theater fire in Chicago in 1903, in which something like 600 people died because of poor construction and bad fire prevention.
And fire exits.
Yeah, exits and fire escapes and that sort of thing. Many people crushed to death. A lot of them mothers and children at a holiday matinee.
Yeah. That was sad. Well, this kind of leads me to my question is about who were the building barons that created a very large amount of wealth in the rebuilding of the city?
Well, again, it's a complicated question. A lot of the building and the rebuilding is outside money. So it's people building here, but are borrowing money. And they come from, and they're from places, you know, the money comes from the East Coast and from London and so on. One of the major efforts right after the fire is a man named William Bross gets on a train, and he's a big investor in Chicago real estate, and William Ogden another, and Ogden decides to rebuild, and Potter Palmer decides to rebuild. I mean, the names in some ways we know. A man named Thomas Bryan buys the first piece of real estate in the burned out loop after the fire. But the money they're getting comes from elsewhere. And this cuts a few different ways. For the most part, it's positive, but a major Chicago investor at the time is, I'm trying to, can't remember his name, Jonathan Scammon, J. Young Scammon, who owns the Marine Bank. He buys the Inter-Ocean newspaper. He has a lot of real estate in Chicago, and he gets right in on the rebuilding. Within days afterward, he is putting up new buildings, but he's borrowing money at a high percentage. And then the panic of 1873 comes along, and he's basically ruined because he has all these mortgages on this money that he's borrowed at 8-9%, and he doesn't have the tenants anymore. He doesn't have the business, and he's basically ruined. And then a good deal, some of this property is in the area that's burned by the 1874 fire, and that just completely wipes him out. And that gets back also to the question before of how did the fire affect markets? It shook them, but they recovered very quickly. The 1873 thing was far worse in terms of markets being, and terrible unemployment and people in the streets demanding work or bread in various ways.
So during that rebirth, Chicago is responsible for a lot of great architecture. Can you name a couple of the great architects that kind of benefited from rebuilding the city?
Sure. Well, that's also a bit of a, it's more delayed than we think. Louis Sullivan, to name one of the most famous, he is one of the people who's in Philadelphia at the time of the panic of 1873. He's brilliant young architect working for the leading firm in Philadelphia. And then the panic hits and his boss says, "We have no work for you, sorry." And he gets on a train and he comes to Chicago, and he gets to know William LeBaron Jenney. And a few years later, he starts a partnership with Dankmar Adler and Sullivan, and their masterpiece of the late 1880s, the auditorium building that's still there. But what we associate with what kind of called the skyscraper revolution, with the heroic rebuilding of Chicago, doesn't really start till the mid 1880s, a dozen or more years after the fire. The city that is built right after the fire, which includes a number of these new architects and architects that are already in the city, is a city that's a little higher. It's more buildings that are 5, 6, 7 stories, but not this. But then when this other building starts in the 1880s, many of these buildings are just taken away. They're outmoded. The best collection of them is the area on along sort of Clarkin Street, just north of the main branch of the river, a whole bunch of buildings of this kind. There are still a few in the downtown area. The Washington building, I mentioned there's a photo, I don't think there's a photograph in the book at near the L at Washington Street and Franklin, these 4, 5, 6-story buildings that are there. But this, again, the famous Chicago architecture is really a phenomenon from the mid-'80s and after.
So we have a question from Rick Werner. Rick, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Actually, I had put a couple of them in there. The Grant Park was created by the landfill. Is that true? Is that what happened?
Yes,
there?
well, this is something, and the maps in the book try to show this very clearly. At the time of the fire, there's very little green space downtown. The area that we know where the now cultural center, formerly the public library, was a thing called Dearborn Park, and that was there. But the lakefront was a tiny little strip, and Michigan Avenue basically came right up to the lake, and then this tiny little strip. Already there was a project of filling that in, or just starting. I should say, I have to add one more thing. Since the early 1850s, there was also a breakwater and railroad tracks out in the lake, about 400 feet out. The Illinois Central Railroad got the rights to build this breakwater, build the tracks along the, on a trestle in the lake, and more or less where those tracks are now. You see them when you go to the Art Institute, or you look down there, because the land was raised around
Raised
it
over it, yeah.
later. But in exchange for building a breakwater beyond that protected the shore. So it made for a little lagoon between these tracks and the lakeshore. But slowly being filled in a good deal by manure from all the horses in the city, and some people just didn't really like that very much. But anyway, suddenly the fire happens and there's all this rubble. And much of it gets hauled into this and fills this lagoon area. So by 1873, it's basically filled up to those tracks. The continuing of the fill goes on after that. And Grant Park, as we know it, reaches its full dimensions in the teens and 20s. And part of the plan of Chicago, the Burnham plan, is the making it into a kind of formally landscaped area. But you see aerial photographs of Grant Park in as late as in the 1920s. You see some things like the Buckingham Fountain, but it looked very bare otherwise besides that, and the Art Institute and one part of it as well. But yes, absolutely. And I've heard stories that when there's excavation for various things like the Grant Park garage, they find all this fire debris. I just don't know that for sure, whether that's true, but certainly it was there. I might add, one of the few things on the lakefront before the fire was this strangely skewed baseball field, in which I think right field was very shallow and left field was enormous, because it was a very small rectangular area where the White Stockings played. And in spite of their name, they're the ancestors of the Cubs, not the White Sox.
Rick, I think you have another question, don't you, Rick?
Yeah, it's kind of on a personal note. I want to know if you think that William Brown got a bad rap in the history recounts. There are a lot of people who really, point fingers at him.
Well, William Brown is the telegraph operator, I believe. At this point, Chicago had a state-of-the-art fire department and a telegraph alarm system. And for reasons that we still don't know, somehow the alarm was turned in, but there was a half-hour delay, and by the time the fire department heard it, fire was basically out of control. And William Brown, that what Rick's talking about, at various points either refused to he sent out through no fault of his own, the first alarm that located the fire wrongly, that he was just told the wrong thing, and by the watchman above him in what was then the city hall called the courthouse that burned in the fire. And then when he was told to correct it, he refused to do it. There's also other things. For reasons that no one has ever explained, his sister was up there with him.
That's my great grandmother there, Sarah.
I'm sorry.
I can tell you why she was there.
Do we want to?
Why?
Yes.
Why was she there,
Yes.
Rick?
She was bringing him dinner. She would do that, I guess, fairly often. She'd bring him dinner. She and her girlfriend brought him dinner. There was a newspaper article in 1911 that kind of tells that story too.
Oh, I know that these things you learn. It's very humbling. I didn't know that, but there she was.
He was quite an accomplished musician, a guitarist. So they would bring him dinner, and then they'd sit and play guitar, and they listened to him.
Well, his job was he was a telegraph operator, and his job was to, if any of the fire stations sent in a report, if an alarm was triggered by telegraph, or if one of the fire stations throughout the city sent, he was to start the alarm, send out the alarm. And he, again, did as he was told by the watchman above him, but he refused to change it to the correct thing. There was a bit of, what can I say, human error, but it's human judgment. It's not like he's evil. I want to see Chicago burn. He did what he thought was right. Maybe he didn't follow protocol exactly, but there he was. But I hope he enjoyed his dinner.
By all accounts, he got to eat his dinner, but
they got out just in time. He was there, and then his relief telegraph operator were there, and then the watchman was there, and the relief watchman. They changed at around 11, and at that point, that area was still okay, but the fire was moving that way very quickly, and then they barely escaped with their lives. Another big story is that there was a jail in the basement of the city hall, and letting the prisoners out rather than have them burned to death is another story.
As I understand, he helped them with that after they evacuated the tower.
There are many different versions of what happened with the prisoners, but including that they let murderers out, but they led them away. But a lot of them did escape, and the more minor felons, they just let out.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rick. Mr. Bennett, Sid Bennett, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
I learned about 15 years ago that there's supposedly a story about a man who said he was actually playing cards in the...
Well, that's an interesting thing, the evolution of the stories.
And supposedly founded one of the schools of journalism in Chicago because of the awful reporting about Mrs. O'Leary. Is there any truth to this story?
First of all, as Dominic and I will tell you, you never say never. No. History just has a way of spitting in your face.
And repeating itself.
I think there's a man named Lewis Cohn or something like that, who confessed. What happened was, first of all, Mrs. O'Leary was brutally demonized, just this figure of hate. But as with the recovery, she becomes this more benign figure of kind of folklore. So there's even a 1935 Norman Rockwell painting of her milking her cow. And on a fire anniversary, someone dresses up as her and walks through the streets. And my favorite part of this is the 1960 Rose Bowl parade. I should say the Tournament of Roses parade. The winning float is the cow tipping over the lantern, and And the grand marshal of that parade was a man named Richard Nixon, who was then vice president of the United States. But once time passed, instead of people saying they didn't do it, there started to be all these people that said they did do it. And the Chicago History Museum has 4 or 5 cowbells that are sure thing. This is the bell that was around the neck of the cow that started the fire. Or like pieces of the true cross. This wood is from the barn. I think it's all bogus. We don't know who started it. I don't think we'll ever know, or I should say even how it started. There was a wonderful book published in 1997 by a man named Richard Bales, who was worked for a title company, and based on a very scrupulous reading of the investigation and property records at the time, speculates, and it's speculation, that a neighbor named Daniel Sullivan started the fire based on where he said he was and what the property was like at the time.
Well, I'm a Sullivan, and I could say that Daniel had nothing to do with that.
Of course, he had nothing to do with it. And again, the real thing is that, in the week before the Great Chicago Fire, there were 24 fires in the city of Chicago, including a major one the night before that badly weakened the fire department. Any of those, under the right circumstances, could have burned this city down. It's made of wood. The sidewalks are raised and made of pine. It's as if you're laying a fire. And connecting the property is all these picket fences, and poof, then it happens. I shouldn't say poof, boom, then it happens.
Do you think, Carl and Dominic, that this would make a very interesting movie series?
Of course.
I know, wouldn't it be?
With Dominic and I getting rich on this, but
may I suggest it?
Actually, I could say this sort of has. If you've seen the documentary, the made of Donald Miller's book, City of the Century, there's a very good section on the fire, including tries to visualize it. There was the WTTW one done a few weeks ago.
Right.
But there's also this remarkable, and you can rent it, but it's also on Turner Classic Movies, this 1937 20th Century Fox in Old Chicago, this retelling of the story, in which it takes Mrs. O'Leary and makes her lace curtain Irish, ages her 30 years, gives her 2 grown-up sons, one of whom is the mayor of Chicago. It changes her name from Catherine to Molly. I mean, it has the cattle in the stockyards stampede. There were nowhere, the fire came nowhere near them. It's completely
fabricated
thing, but it's got terrific special effects. And I don't know if those of you are old enough to remember You Are There. The Walter Cronkite kind of faux news that would cover historical events, and he'd say, all things are as they were then, except you are there. When they covered the Great Chicago Fire and used footage from in old Chicago to simulate the fire. It's Don Amici and Tyrone Power as the O'Leary brothers, and it's just a great movie. It except for the fact there was an O'Leary family and there was a fire and there was a Chicago, everything else is made up.
May I just mention also that there soon will be an exhibit at the Chicago History Museum, and
yes,
Carl is in charge of that, or partially in charge.
Thank you. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yes, there'll be 150th, and there was one at the 100th, and one of the 50th. But this, and it's interesting to see how these evolve, because I think this will try to be a good deal more inclusive than the early ones, as the WTTW documentary tried to be.
Right. Well, I guess
Amici will not be in it.
Don Amici will not be in it. I believe he's from southern Wisconsin somewhere,
I
or
think so.
was from.
Yeah.
so. Mike does have a personal account that he wants to share. He has knowledge of his story from a personal account about the fire. Mike, go ahead.
Hi there, everybody. I came upon a paper written by Frank J. Loesch, Loesch.
Carl knows it.
Frank Loesch, who in his elderly years wrote this paper in 1927. And he recounts his early 20s. He worked for Western Union in the city of Chicago, and he lived in a boarding house, I believe it was on Dearborn near Ohio, and lived through the Chicago fire. And I found it to be a rather gripping moment by moment, day by day account of the fire. He ended up with thousands of other people living outdoors in a field northwest of Fullerton and Lincoln.
Yes. I'm sorry. Are you finished?
Typographical errors. I mean, he obviously typed it up himself. The paper can be found.
Yeah, you're kind of breaking up, Mike.
Let me say, just to
I was going to say, Carl, maybe you could do some finishing words on that story.
Sure. Loesch, yes. In the book, first of all, in writing the book, I read about 150 firsthand accounts, and they go up to like 1946, 75 years after the fire. And a lot of them are in the Chicago History Museum, but a lot of them have been published and are online, including Loesch's. And I give in the notes of the book links to where you can find them and how you can get them. And they are crucial to trying to understand how the fire was actually lived. And they're written either letters right at the time to family, up to things 75 years later, to things in the middle, like Loesch's. And they're absolutely wonderful. And what he's talking about there is that a lot of people fled and they had no place to stay. And some in the city cemetery and what is now Lincoln Park, but farther out, even within city limits at that time, a lot of Chicago wasn't built at all. It was just open prairie.
Right. Well, we're closing in on our end time, and I really, really enjoyed this hour. And I'm so proud to be a Chicagoan anyways, and I'm sure everybody here just feels a little bit richer with history of this knowledge of this great fire. Thank you so much, Carl, and thank you so much, Dominic, for spending this hour with us, and we appreciate all of your knowledge. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the members of the Union League Club for supporting us.